Hi everyone, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These lands have been home to indigenous peoples since time immemorial, and their rich history and enduring presence remind us of our shared responsibility to honor this truth. Today, we invite you to listen with open hearts and minds as we explore the profound legacy of this land. A story that begins long before the city we know as Toronto existed. Let us reflect on the past, acknowledge the present, and consider our role in shaping a future rooted in the understanding and respect.
The name Takano originates from the Mohawk language and was used from the indigenous people long before European settlers arrived. The word Takano roughly translated to "where there are trees standing in the water." It is believed that to refer to the area around the northern part of Lake Simcoe, where the Redden people placed wooden stakes in the water to create fish wires. Over time, European explorers and settlers adapted the indigenous name into different spelling, eventually leading to Toronto. The name Toronto was officially adopted in 1834 when the town of York was incorporated as the city of the Toronto. Indigenous people have inhabited the Toronto area for over 11,000 years, dating back to the last ice age with archaeological evidence. Evidence of early human activity includes the snowshoes, pottery, and burial sites found along the Don and the Humber rivers. The oldest known sites in Toronto, such as the Reform sites, reveal settlements from the indigenous community that predate European contact. The Toronto Carrying Place Trail, a crucial indigenous trade and travel route, connects Lake Ontario to Lake Simcoe and beyond, facilitating movement and commerce. The legendary of Five Nations by the English, the Confederacy is probably called the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, meaning "people of the long house." The Confederacy was formed by the prophet known as the Peacemaker with the help of Anian Wata, more commonly known as Hiwata. The exact date of the joining of the nation is unknown and said to be time immemorial, making it one of the first and longest-lasting partitionary democrats in the world. Haudenosaunee flag is the flag used to represent the first Six Nations of the Iraqis. It's a purple flag with four connected right squares and an eastern right pine tree in the center. For near 200 years, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were a powerful nation. Its power extends from what is today New York State, north into present-day Ontario, near the modern city of Toronto, and Quebec along the Lake of Ontario. The ancestors of the Mississauga of the Credit migrated into southern Ontario after the English conquered southern Ontario in 1615. They continued their attack of northwest in the territories occupied by the Mississauga and their allies. By the end of the 13th century, the Mississauga and their allies had succeeded in driving the Indigenous back into their homeland south of Lake Ontario. At the conclusion of the conflict, many Mississaugas settled at the eastern end of the Lake Ontario. Other Mississaugas settled surrounding Lake Ontario, and the area within the modern city of Toronto. From the time of the conquest of the New France in 1760, the British Crown recognized the inherited right of the First Nation and the ownership of the land they occupy. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 confirmed the First Nations' sovereignty over their lands and prevent anyone, other than the Crown, from purchasing that land. Indigenous way of life before European settlement is mainly agriculture. The corns were staple crops cultivated by indigenous nations. Hunting and fishing, deer, bear, fish from Lake Ontario and provide substances. Trade networks. Toronto was a key meeting place where the indigenous nations exchanged goods, stories, and alliances. Spiritual and social practice. Indigenous governments was based on consensus, councils, and claim system with spiritual ceremonies honoring the land and ancestors. The arrival of European settlers. French expedition in the early 16th. French explorers like Samuel de Champlain arrived in the area that is now Toronto. They established trade relationships with indigenous groups such as Homari and Agri, who helped them navigate land and find resources. These early explorers had trade relied heavily on indigenous knowledge of the land for survival. First contact and trade, the French were primarily focused on fur trade, exchanging goods like metal tools, clothes, and firearms, and from indigenous groups. This trade became a major part of the economy and led more European presence in the region. The disease have brought by the arrival of Europeans like smallpox, influenza, which devastated indigenous population. Since indigenous people have no immunity to this disease, many communities suffer from high death rates, significantly decreased their numbers. British control of the shifting to settling. Following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British gained control over French territories, including the area around Toronto. This marked the beginning of British colonial rule in Canada, representing French influence in the region. The British encouraged European settlers to come and from the land, leading to the establishment of agricultural communities. These settlers were mostly farmers from Britain and other European countries, and they transformed the landscape into forests into fields. As more settlers arrived, they cleared more land for farming and built houses, homes, and villages. This expansion disrupted indigenous people's traditional ways of life, including hunting, fishing, and gathering, as the land they depended on was taken over by settlers. As British settlers continued to expand their presence, they increased encroachment on indigenous lands. Many indigenous groups were present to give up their traditional territory in exchange for promise of land and resources. The British began negotiating treaties with indigenous nations to take control of the land. The Toronto Purchase in 1787 involved the Mississauga of the Credit was one of the most significant agreements in the region. However, these treaties were often misunderstood or poorly translated, and many indigenous people did not fully understand what they were giving up. While the British acknowledged the indigenous ownership of land, the terms of the treaties were often unfair. The Mississauga of the Credit, for example, were promised compensation of the land, but received very little in return. This resulted in the long-term displacement and hardship for indigenous communities. Talking about Royal Proclamation of 1763, it is a critical document in the history of indigenous-crown relations. It was issued by the King George III, and this proclamation became after the end of the Seven Years' War when Britain acquired significant new territories in North America. The proclamation sought to establish British colonial rule over these territories, Most important, it recognized Indigenous people's right to their lands. With this reconciliation marked as a significant shift in the legal relation between the Crown and Indigenous nations, acknowledged their sovereignty and land rights too. The proclamation principles were applied in the Toronto Purchase in 1787. The British Crown negotiated with the Mississauga of the credit of the land for the area around present-day Toronto. According to the proclamation, the land transfer section should have been done through formally fair agreement with the Crown, but yet the Toronto Purchase was marked by contested terms, and Mississauga did not feel adequately compensated for the land they split off. To conclude with this issue surrounding the Toronto Purchase, it clearly showed that it was a challenge to enforce the Royal Proclamation provision. Although it was intended to protect the indigenous land practice, however, such agreements were often treated unfairly and lack of proper compensation for those indigenous nations. Let's look at the key provision of the Royal Proclamation. First, they acknowledge the indigenous right. For the first time, the proclamation officially recognized the indigenous people's ownership of the land they occupy, and this was a major shift from previous policy that had largely ignored indigenous rights. Land transition. The proclamation regulated only the Crown could acquire land from the indigenous people, ensured that there were formal agreements in place for any land transfer. This action was intended to protect indigenous territories from unauthorized settlers and exploration. Settlement boundaries is also placed a boundary on where European settlers could move to, especially prohibiting settlements west of Appalachian Mountains. The goal here was to minimize the conflict in between settlers and indigenous nations by keeping the two groups separated. The symbolism and significance of the Royal Proclamation go beyond its legal provision. It marks a reconciliation of indigenous sovereignty, acknowledges of indigenous people as the right owners of their land, and this shift towards legal recognition of their rights. The proclamation also sought to protect indigenous land from encroachment by settlers. It also stated the land could be acquired through formal agreement with the Crown, which was a significant attempt to establish a system of governance over indigenous territories. The proclamation was not just a legal document, but it also used symbolic recognition of indigenous land ownership and sovereignty. The impact of the proclamation have some positive reconciliation that it was formally recognized for the first time. However, despite its provision, settlers ignored and bypassed the proclamation, leading to some land disposition and conflict. For the long-term effect, many indigenous people faced continued land loss despite the proclamation promise. The legacy of the proclamation is both profound and complicated. It established a foundation for recognizing indigenous land rights, will influence future treaties in between indigenous people and the Crown. Despite the recognition of rights, the proclamation provisions were frequently ignored by the settlers and colonial authorities, essential lack of enforcement that allowed for the continued freedom of the indigenous land. However, in the modern times, the proclamation has been referenced in legal cases that uphold indigenous land claim and sovereignty, since that it continues to be a crucial part of the legal and historical things regarding indigenous rights in Canada, although the fact that the gap in between reconciliation and enforcement remains a huge issue. Let's talk about the creation of Toronto. The foundation of York in 1793 by John Gray Simcoe, or the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, was part of the broad British effort to establish a strategic colonial outpost on the northern shore of the Lake Ontario. The location was chosen in part because of its proximity to important indigenous trade routes and resources. However, this encroachment of indigenous land had profound consequences for the people who had lived in the area of the thousand years. Land surrenders. As the British colonial government sought to expand settlers and infrastructure in York, they intimidated a series of land surrenders from the indigenous people, often forged treaties that were not fully understood by the indigenous signatories. Many of these agreements, such as Toronto Purchase in 1787 and 1805, saw large tracts of land around the future city of Toronto exchanged for token payments, or in some cases with little to no compensation. These agreements were frequently signed under or with promises that were not kept, leading to dispossession of land and resources. Displacements of lost and hunting grounds, indigenous people were pushed off their traditional lands and faced disruption to their ways of life. Many were forced to move to less fertile and remote areas, which led to a decline in their traditional economies, including hunting, fishing, and gathering. The expansion of York and later Toronto increased crowding out indigenous people from their ancestors' territories. Marginalized policy and the rise of British law in Toronto. Colonial legal framework imposed European laws on the land, undermining Indigenous system of governance and land stewardship. The British colonial authority implemented policy that disregard Indigenous legal and cultural norms, including the enforcement of the Crown's sovereignty over Indigenous territories. This legal framework systematically undermined the autonomy of Indigenous people, rendering them subjects of the British law rather than equal citizens with a right to self-determination. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, the fourth issued before the establishment of York, this proclamation had lasting effect on the indigenous people in the region. The proclamation established that indigenous land could only be ceded to the Crown through the formal treaties. However, this proclamation was often ignored or manipulated by colonial government, leading to land dispossession and the erosion of indigenous authority. The legal reconciliation of indigenous land rights in this proclamation was largely theoretical and did not prevent the increased encroachment of settlers on indigenous territories. Indian Act and Policy Implementation. The Indian Act, introduced 1876, was a continuation of a policy to assimilate indigenous people into European-based settler society. While it was enacted after Toronto had already been established, the policies that emerged from this act were rooted in the ideas of colonialism that took hold in the 18th century. The Indian Act further marginalized indigenous people by limiting their rights, attempting to eliminate their cultural practice, and controlling land use and governance within their communities. The effects of this policy were deeply felt by indigenous people in the Toronto area and beyond. We want to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional territory of Wendat, the Henry-Wilson, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This land is still home to many indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and it is our collective responsibility to honor that relationship. What you see here tells a powerful story, a story of what was and what has become. On the left, the intricate fishing wiles built by the Wendat people along these very short lines, engineers marvels that sustain communities for generations. On the right are modern skylines, impaired in its own way, built upon layers of erasure. The number tells devastating stories. Where once there were thrilling communities of 20,000 people, by 1850, fewer than 100 indigenous souls remain in this area. 96% of the original place name have been replaced. Names that have meaning, that told the story of this land. Policy like the Indian Act make it illegal for our people to practice our ceremonies, to govern ourselves, even to leave reserve without permission. Despite this painful story, I stand before you today not just to speak of wounds, but also healing. One of the incredible resilience of indigenous people and the growing movement toward reconciliation in this city we are now share. In 2010, 203 years after the original Toronto purchase, the Mississauga of the Credit finally received compensation for their stolen lands. That 145 million settlement wasn't just about money. It's all about justice delayed, but not denied. Those funds now support language revitalization programs, house initiatives, and education opportunities for Mississauga youth. The First Story app, developed by Indigenous researchers, now allows anyone with a smartphone to discover the original landscape of this city, to see through the concrete to the scarce sites and stories that still exist if you know where to look. Perhaps most exciting is the creation of the urban reserve, like the one at Fort York, the first indigenous governed land in Toronto since colonialization. This isn't symbolic, this is about real justification, real self-determination return to this territory. And there is hope in the number two. 72% of Toronto people now support mandatory Indigenous history in school. Enrollment in written language program has increased 3 times since 2015. Indigenous-owned businesses are thriving across the Greater Toronto Area. From 2005 to 2021, Indigenous-owned businesses grew by 42.7%, but the share of total business remains stable. Growth peaked in 2018 and then declined slightly. Statistics Canada showed that Indigenous-owned businesses were disrupted, with 45.7% owned by First Nation people, 47.1% owned by Métis, and 1.9% owned by Inuit. This progress didn't happen by accident. It happened because of the tireless work of Indigenous activities, elders, and allies who refuse to let our story be forgotten. So where do we go from here? Reconciliation isn't a checkbox. It is an ongoing process that requires concrete action from all of us. First, education. Every student in Toronto should graduate knowing as much about the dish with one spoon treaty as they do about the War of 1822. They should read Richard Wagner alongside Shakespeare, study the impact that Western schools alongside in World War II. Second, land justice. The city of Vancouver has committed to return 10% of its land to Indigenous stewardship. Maybe Toronto can do the same. Let's start with the mouth of the Humber River, where those ancient fishing wilds once stood, and return it to Indigenous care. Third, legal reform. Canada has adopted the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Now we need to implement it at the municipal level. Imagine an indigenous-led tribunal to review land disputes right here at City Hall. Finally, cultural space. The Toronto Festival could be our answer to the St. Stephen Indian Market, a world-class celebration of Indigenous art and culture. Pictures and what's behind in the raw. Handed social dance in Nevin Phillips Square, in the frozen in the Eagle. Chief Secretary Lafont reminds us that reconciliation is about rebuilding what was stolen, brick by brick. Each of you here today holds a brick. The question is, will you help us to build? Thank you for listening our presentation. We hope the endangered right of in the Toronto could soon be restored in the coming years.